Digging hundreds of meters below the Earth's surface in search of minerals and fossil fuels is a risky business. But miners in Poland are facing the additional threat of COVID-19. More than 3,000 underground workers have contracted the virus since the start of the pandemic. That's prompted the government to shut down 12 state-run operations.
Our next step is to temporarily suspend work at the coal mines where new cases were detected and where not all of the crews have been tested for the coronavirus.
The remaining public and privately owned mines are still operating, and many other industries have recently started up again. The government is planning to restore road, rail and air links with EU countries in the next few days. But the emergence of new clusters could force more mines to close. That would be a serious blow for the economy, as the sector has been a growth engine for Poland in recent years. Mining operations in other countries are also under scrutiny for putting workers at risk. So far, at least 4,000 miners have been infected in 18 countries. Unions in Chile are threatening to down tools unless workers are tested and allowed to self-isolate. And a court in Brazil has ordered a number of shafts to shut down after 188 miners tested positive. This has led to countries like Australia, which have managed to contain the spread of the coronavirus, gaining market share. Mining companies in Poland say while they are taking precautions to ensure workers' safety, halting operations isn't the answer.
You can't just shut down a mine at the press of a button. It's a big job to isolate and secure large areas in order to avoid fires and prevent shafts from collapsing.
Critics say some mining companies are prioritizing profits over people, and if COVID-19 cases keep rising, they could be forced to close permanently. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on the story, let's speak with Kirsten Francescone. She's the Latin America Program Coordinator at MiningWatch Canada, and she joins us now from Ottawa. Welcome to Money Talks. Now, you co-authored a recent report that looked at how mining operations were being carried out during this pandemic. What did you find?
Hi, thanks very much for the opportunity to share some of the findings of this jointly produced report. Yes, MiningWatch is one of the authors, and there are 6 other international organizations that co-authored this report. The findings, it analyzed over 500 sources, from media to workers' union statements to community organization statements. And what we found was that the mining industry is indeed profiting from the pandemic, and in doing so, putting workers and mining affected communities at greater risk. Among the trends that we identified that are sort of across the global scope, we found that that mining companies are ignoring the threat of the pandemic and continuing to operate, and in doing so, obviously putting workers and communities at grave risk. That there's a continuing, and in some cases an escalation of violence against defenders or communities that have been sort of opposed to mining in the past. And a lot of these long-standing conflicts have been recently repressed by governments using COVID-19 as the justification for that repression. We've seen also a sort of the use of mining companies trying to take advantage of the circumstances to become saviors to the public eyes, especially those who have quite dirty reputations, by donating money or sanitary supplies in countries where they have been accused of serious health and environmental violations. And finally, that they've been securing regulatory changes to eliminate public oversight and expedite, for example, permits for mining operations to go ahead. And so those are some of the big overarching findings.
Yes, and you've also found that it's not just the companies themselves who appear to be putting profits before people, but governments seem to be enabling them, don't they?
Absolutely. I think what we have noted is that, especially in the case of governments taking a strong stance at the beginning to control whether or not a mining operation can continue at full capacity, has actually had a real impact on the number of outbreaks, for example, at a particular mine. And so in the instances when pro-mining governments have enabled mining companies to operate as per business as usual, we've seen that there have been quite a few serious outbreaks, like the case referenced in today's show in Poland. but across the board, really, where governments haven't been making strong responses to these companies to require them to halt. Companies have not been acting proactively and doing that on themselves. And so, yes, indeed, governments have been taking that move, and also in all of these other items, for example, repressing public protest or militarizing or taking advantage of lockdown measures to encroach on people's freedom of association, on people's freedom of movement, is particularly linked to mining operations.
So is there a way that miners can ensure the safety of their workers while continuing their operations during this pandemic?
I mean, I think the challenge that we identified in the report is that the mining industry has also taken the opportunity to deem itself an essential service. Or an essential sector for this moment, where many of us are thinking that essential services in the time of a pandemic means healthcare workers and frontline workers that are directly addressing the pandemic. In our position in the paper, at least what we are able to demonstrate, is that when mines were ordered to move to care and maintenance, and when workforces were then compensated for being off, then outbreaks were avoided. In all other circumstances, what we're seeing is that because the virus primarily is working to infect people and workers are asymptomatic, the kinds of screenings that are happening at the mine level, so temperature checks, for example, are unable to detect infected workers. And so when we see let's say 2 workers are infected at a mine, the company then massively tests all 2,000 of those workers and discovers that 90% of those that test positive are asymptomatic. And so there is really no way to control, unless you're doing a shutdown, that you're going to be able to prevent an outbreak, unless, for example, you're testing every single worker going in and out of that mine, which then calls question to bigger issues about how mining companies are able to have access to certain test kits when sovereign governments aren't able to obtain the quantities that they need for public health.
Yes, Kirsten Francescone, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for shedding some light on the issue for us.